Hi, it's me, Ingrid Infp, and I'm going to talk about something that is important at work, a difference between INFPs and INFJs. I found an article a few years ago called INFJs and INFPs, What They Learn from Each Other's Personal Boundaries. And it's by a psychiatrist who talks about how she had a hard time but she's an INFJ, and she had a hard time with FI users around her and how they approached their boundaries with patients. It's kind of interesting because I don't really agree with everything that she says, because in her view, the INFPs have a more flexible boundary compared to INFJs, which in my experience is more the other way around. I think the INFPs are pretty strong in their boundaries, at least to start with, and INFJs need to learn that concept, and otherwise they'll just keep giving without putting a boundary up. But it's interesting that there's an article about a doctor who's an INFJ talking about INFP doctors, because that's not very common. So I'm not going to read the article, but it's interesting that she talks about, well, this is on Personality Hacker, so they use the words harmony for FE and they use authenticity for FI. So keep that in mind. She talks about how there's a conflict between FI and FE at her workplace, because authenticity or FI users are more likely to take patients on a case-by-case individual basis and sometimes go beyond and out of their way for certain patients, but not do so consistently as an FE user would. So an FE user would want to treat everybody fairly and equally, and like that excludes the notion of case-by-case basis, because you kind of want to level up the field for everyone, and that is kind of what we are taught, is that everybody should be given the same treatment, the same level of care, regardless of how old they are, their ethnicity, everything. But something that is important in medicine is also the fact that everybody is different. So the fact that somebody is old or younger might actually have a therapeutic meaning. You can't give certain medication to people who are too old, for example, or people who are too young. Some patients can't swallow tablets, and then they can't take the medicine like other people would. So you need to think about a case-to-case basis in a lot of cases. But it is wrong to treat one person who is very similar to another person an extremely different way just because you have biases, or because you are giving preferential treatment just because you like a certain patient. That is wrong. But you do need to take into account different personalities, different physical qualities of different people. And that's where INFPs kind of do things differently for each patient. Even though we try to treat everybody equally, you cannot do the equal treatment for everybody because it's not going to work. So this person was kind of confused as an INFJ as to how INFPs were surviving this by going beyond and like giving patients their cell phone numbers, which I would also be a little bit careful of doing. But yeah. So she didn't understand that because she would just be putting boundaries pretty systematically with people. Well, for me, for INFPs, basically, it was more of like a case-by-case thing. So if they put boundaries, it was that they felt like they were being pushed too far. So she realized that she couldn't do the same as her FI friends. And she felt like the patients were expecting that of her, which doesn't really matter, to be honest. Patients feel sometimes entitled to all sorts of things that aren't actually in their best interest in terms of health. But sometimes you have to go with that. That's patients will not do as you tell them to do. And I believe in free choice as an INFP. So if somebody doesn't want to do what I say that they should do, then that's on them, you know? Maybe it is better for them to follow their own. Maybe my advice, even if it's highly qualified, is not the end all be all. So she was talking about how FE users, those that have poorly developed boundaries, tended to get burnouts pretty easily, while the FI users did not. I would say I'd be a little bit careful about making such generalizations, but I do think that FE is a tough function to have if you are very sensitive and empathetic, because it feels like you get hurt wherever you go by people's feelings and wanting to please everybody. Well, with FI, we are much better at setting the boundaries and knowing what is best for us. So in that case, we are a little bit better about that. She doesn't really understand FI because she talks about detecting the nuances of subjective feelings and values, which is what FI does. But she says that kind of FI users are more prone to blurring the lines of policies and standards, which I would say that FE users can do that too. I think it's TE that puts the lines of policies. So I'm not entirely sure about that. I do blur the lines sometimes, but I think it's mostly the FE users who are being too nice to certain patients because they feel guilty, who in general blur the lines sometimes. But I can't say. I don't know what other doctors do. She talks about how FE is that she wants to find an objective standard that she can rely on so that she can deal with every case. She wants every case to be treated fairly without any exceptions. But because she has this internal dilemma all the time, she has a lot of uncomfort. What she says is, somehow the authenticity users don't seem to experience the torturous feelings I do of having my objective professional values wrenched around by each outside of the norm expectation leveled at me by a patient. And that is false. Of course, I have these torturous feelings every time what I say and what the patient asks of me is different. It's hard being a doctor, basically. So let's see. Then she talks about other stuff. She talks about how FI users use their value system, and Harmony talks more about the whole social system, and they want every decision to be weighed against other people. And she says that she feels like she's part of everyone, So everything that she does is calibrated towards other people. So FI users don't really do that, but I fail to see how that actually changes the patient-doctor relationship, to be honest. Then she talks about how basically she talks about ethical stress, which is something that is talked a lot about in the healthcare these days, because doctors who are placed under ethical stress, which is basically that they feel like they can't do what's right for the patients because of lack of resources, because of the healthcare system having problems. The patients want to do more for their patients, but they can't because they are limited either by the system or by other, like pharmaceutical companies, by their bosses, that there are no that there's no medication available, or that it's too expensive for the patient, or that insurance companies don't pay for it, all sorts of stuff, and the patient can't get the optimal level of care that could be available because of all the problems in the system. That is something that a lot of doctors experience, and that is what leads a lot of doctors to get burnt out in the end. So that affects every doctor, but it affects good doctors most, unfortunately, because they want to do such good for their patients. But I think that it does affect INFPs a little bit more, because we have this frustration against the system as a TE, like inferior TE. INFJs, I think, are also frustrated by this, but in another manner, because they want this goodness of the world and they're idealists. But it's less that they're against the system. So I think that FI doctors might kind of try to circumvent the system. So in that way they blur the lines. But they still have to do what they're told, basically. So we all are in the same system, and we all have to deal with it in some manner. So that is what she talks about. So for her, she talks about, then she goes on a tangent. So I won't really be talking about it, but it's basically how FE users follow the dress code and FI users don't. Like if somebody has to go to a wedding with a dress code, the FI user might decide not to follow the dress code to the letter. And that frustrates her. I don't really know why she talks about this. But yeah, she does talk about how FE users want the playing fields to be the same for everybody, and they don't want people to stick out. So she didn't realize that they were, like when she sees an FI user that is not following the dress code, she says that they're asking too much of her, basically. But the FI user doesn't realize that because they don't see it as being such a big problem. So she talks about how patients ask too much of her by wanting to be different than other patients that she's treated. And I do see that point, but it's not such a big problem for me. She seems to think that INFPs have much easier time saying yes and no when it comes to demands of their time and effort. And I'm not sure about that. Maybe we are, but what she says next is kind of not true, is that when they do say no, they don't carry with them the pain of everyone who didn't get their needs or expectations met. And that is false. I say no and I feel super guilty afterwards, that I couldn't help the patient and the patient gets mad. So it's just, maybe I have an easier time saying no, but then I get all of these feelings afterwards, basically. And at the end of the article, she talks about what can INFPs and INFJs learn from each other. And she talks about how FE users need to learn not to take full responsibilities for the feelings of others. And that is true. FE users feel that they're responsible for everybody's feelings. And it's going to be hard for you to work as a doctor if you feel that way all the time and don't learn to put boundaries up. So that helped her. It helped her free up energy for self-care, which she really needed. And then she suggests for FI users to make choices that might serve a social standard instead of, and that would be more meaningful than having every single interaction be different, because it will give a sense of a whole, basically. So that is about this article. There's much more to say about boundaries and INFPs and INFJs. This is just an example from an article that is about doctors, so I feel like I'm the most qualified person to talk about this, as there aren't many INFP doctors out there that can comment on this article. I might make a video about this later, but this will have to do for the moment. So tell me what you guys think about boundaries and about how we treat different people equally, or how we deal with people on the individual basis. If there are any doctors out there watching, please tell me what you think. Have a great day.